A quiet town shaken by storms. Nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, Auburn is the kind of place you might drive through and almost forget to notice, though the locals would argue its charm is unforgettable. Quaint, tree-lined streets, historic red brick buildings, and a strong sense of community define this tight-knit town. Auburn's charm doesn't come from high-rise skylines or big city attractions, it comes from its soul. It's the kind of place where the mailman knows your name, the mom-and-pop diners are always lively with chatter, and parents feel safe letting their kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on. Auburn takes pride in its history, stretching back to the 19th century when it thrived as a hub of manufacturing and small-town ingenuity. Proud of its heritage, the town boasts landmarks like the Harriet Tubman Home and the Seward House Museum, quietly reminding visitors of its important role in America's story. This is a place where time almost seems to move slower, making it easy to overlook the dark edges that sometimes lurk behind even the most picturesque facades. With a population just hovering around 10,000, Auburn rarely sees the chaos or concerns of urban life. Serious crimes are nearly unheard of, at least they were. The biggest news typically revolves around the high school football team, a spirited local election, or perhaps a new boutique opening just off Main Street. Crime in Auburn, when it happens at all, is usually limited to minor offenses. An errant teen breaking curfew, a neighbor dispute over property lines, or maybe the occasional graffiti scrawled beneath the railroad bridge. Headlines in the Auburn Gazette tend to focus on bake sales, 4th of July parades, and church fundraisers more than anything scandalous. For years, residents have proudly touted Auburn as a haven, a safe refuge from the fast-paced chaos of modern life. Doors were often left unlocked, and neighbors didn't think twice about borrowing a cup of sugar or stopping by unannounced for coffee. There was an unspoken trust in the air, the kind of trust that comes from generations of families putting down roots in the same soil, attending the same schools, and going to the same Sunday services. Outsiders saw Auburn as an ideal getaway, serene, predictable, and far removed from the stormy, unpredictable nature of the outside world. But every perfect postcard has an unseen corner, and Auburn's was no exception. Beneath its placid surface ran a silent current of human flaws, jealousies, secrets, and tensions existing quietly between neighbors, co-workers, and even friends. Of course, nobody really talked about it. Auburn wasn't the kind of town where people aired their dirty laundry. Problems were smiled away or buried under a polite veneer of small-town pleasantries. This tranquil life was shaken to its foundation one fateful morning in the summer of 2012. The kind of crime that Auburn had only experienced through fictional television dramas unfolded within its picturesque borders. As word spread, it wasn't just Auburn that felt the blow. It was the entire state of New York, stunned by the notion that no place, no matter how peaceful or insulated, could fully escape the reach of darkness. The murder of Jessica Miller didn't just leave Auburn grappling for answers, it shattered the town's bubble of safety. For the first time in decades, people looked over their shoulders. Parents started locking their doors and setting alarms. The sense of trust that had once been the town's strongest foundation now came with an asterisk. Auburn's idyllic quiet wasn't lost overnight, but it would never return to the way it was before that summer. For those who lived there, the crime became not just a moment of fear, but a permanent scar, a reminder that no town is ever as picture-perfect as it seems. The fateful day. It began as an ordinary summer day in Auburn, with the sun rising lazily over the horizon, flooding the town's quiet streets with soft, golden light. As the calendar flipped to August 18, 2012, the morning air was humid and still, the kind that hinted at an oppressively hot, sluggish day ahead. Lawns were dotted with dew, and the faint hum of cicadas buzzed from tree to tree. For most Auburn residents, that Saturday wasn't much different from any other summer day, a time to run errands, mow the lawn, or relax in the shade with a glass of iced tea. But for Jessica Miller, it would be her last morning. Jessica Miller was a vibrant young woman of 28. She had a brilliant future ahead, having recently graduated with honors from Syracuse University's prestigious law program. Known for her sharp intellect and warm smile, Jessica had already landed a job at a local law firm, earning the admiration of co-workers and clients alike. To her neighbors and friends, she was the definition of a steady, responsible young woman who balanced ambition with kindness. But on this particular day, Jessica's future was cruelly snatched away. Sometime between dawn and mid-morning, her life met with violence in her own home, her cherished sanctuary. It started quietly. Distant neighbors later said they hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary, no shouts or commotion. The normal drone of suburban life proceeded as if nothing was amiss. But inside the walls of Jessica's modest home on Elmwood Drive, something unimaginable was unfolding. At around 8:30 a.m., Jessica was believed to have been going about her morning routine. According to investigators, she was still in her pale blue pajama set, suggesting she hadn't yet dressed for the day. A half-finished mug of coffee sat lukewarm on the kitchen counter, a subtle reminder of the life interrupted. The breakfast table was undisturbed, save for an empty cereal box that suggested she had been preparing to eat, the kind of small detail that gave her story a painfully real and relatable edge. Not much later, the tranquility shattered. What exactly happened in those moments remains a question shrouded in uncertainty. Forensic evidence pointed to a struggle, a sudden and violent confrontation. Blood spatter patterns on the hardwood floor and walls told the story of a desperate attempt to fight off her attacker. Jessica's strong will and determination were evident in the signs of resistance. Her nails left faint, telltale scratches on surfaces nearby, as if she had fought with every ounce of strength to survive. The echoes of that struggle, however silent to the outside world, seemed deafening within those now haunted walls. The scene at Jessica's home wasn't discovered until hours later. Ryan Carter, her boyfriend of 3 years, arrived at her house that afternoon. He had tried calling her phone repeatedly in the morning, but the calls went unanswered, a small detail he didn't initially think much of. Jessica often worked late nights and had a habit of sleeping in on Saturdays, but as the hours ticked by with no reply, Ryan grew uneasy. By 2 p.m., his unease became full-blown dread. He drove over to her house, parking his silver sedan in the driveway he had parked in dozens of times before. That day, the driveway felt eerily quiet. Ryan entered the house through the front door, which was unlocked. He later described calling out her name as he stepped inside, his voice echoing slightly in the unnaturally still air. The living room was unusually quiet, the faint sound of the TV humming in the background. A plate of cookies sat uneaten on the coffee table. Then, his eyes caught the first signs of chaos: a toppled vase on a side table, a chair pushed askew, and splashes of something dark leading out of the room. Panic surged as he followed the trail into the hallway and towards the stairs leading down to the basement. At the bottom of those steps lay Jessica. She was face down, her body partly sprawled across the bottom stairs, almost as if she had stumbled trying to escape. Blood pooled around her head, staining the wooden stairs a deep, sickening red. Her left hand still clutched a few loose strands of hair, later determined to be not her own. Ryan froze at the sight, his breath catching. In the moments that followed, he did what most people would. He ran. He sprinted back out of the house, fumbling for his phone as he dialed 911. His voice, described by dispatchers as panicked but coherent, detailed the horrifying scene and urged first responders to arrive immediately. The official call, placed at 2:07 p.m., set into motion a flurry of local police, paramedics, and eventually detectives converging on Elmwood Drive. Auburn wasn't accustomed to such chaos. The wail of sirens pierced the small-town hush, drawing curious neighbors to their porches, whispering theories and fears. By the time emergency personnel arrived, it was already too late for Jessica. Paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene, while officers began meticulously securing the area as a crime scene, snapping caution tape along the neatly trimmed front yard. The sense of disbelief that swept through Auburn was almost palpable. This wasn't a town where such things happened. This wasn't a family torn apart by a random act of violence, at least not yet. This wasn't Jessica Miller, a symbol of everything bright in their community, brutally cut short, but it was. And what police and the town would uncover in the days and weeks to come would shake them all to their core. For Auburn, there was no going back. Life had been split into before Jessica's murder and the after was a desolate place filled with uncertainty and quiet mourning. The first discovery. The discovery of Jessica Miller's lifeless body marked a turning point for both her loved ones and the quiet town of Auburn. It all started with Ryan Carter, her boyfriend of 3 years, who had grown increasingly uneasy after failing to reach Jessica the entire morning. What began as worry soon transformed into dread, and by the time he parked his silver sedan in front of her modest 2-story home on Elmwood Drive that afternoon, Ryan's mind was racing. Jessica was a creature of habit, a planner by nature. She didn't ignore phone calls without good reason, nor did she leave people wondering where she was. Something wasn't adding up. As Ryan stood outside the house, he noticed the faintest oddities. The blinds were drawn tightly across the windows, giving the exterior an unusually vacant feel despite the warm summer day. The front door's mat was slightly askew, and the mailbox brimmed with leaflets from local stores, small details that might have looked insignificant at first but would later feel like pieces of a dark puzzle. He knocked on the door once, then twice. No answer. Tension built in his chest as he pressed his ear against the wood, hoping to hear movement from within, but all was silent, save for the faint hum of cicadas in the hot afternoon air. Ryan tried the doorknob, surprised when it turned easily in his hand. The front door was unlocked. Auburn might have been a town of unlocked doors and neighborly trust, but Jessica had always been careful. She was aware of the world's dangers, even in a town where crimes rarely made headlines. Steeling himself, Ryan pushed the door open and called out her name. "Jess, you here? It's me." His voice echoed in the stillness. The living room lay before him, inviting yet unnaturally calm, like a photograph frozen in time. The television hummed softly in the background, its muted screen flashing a late-morning talk show. A throw blanket lay crumpled on the couch next to an unopened magazine. The coffee table in front of it bore a half-eaten plate of cookies and a tall water glass with beads of condensation trickling down its sides, suggesting it had been poured just hours earlier. The room reeked of normalcy, yet Ryan couldn't shake the shadow of wrongness. He ventured farther inside, noticing that a side table near the staircase was overturned, its contents, a vase, a couple of books, a framed photo, strewn across the floor as if knocked over in haste. "Jess!" he called again, louder this time, trying to will her to appear at the top of the stairs with her familiar teasing grin. But there was no reply. Moving toward the kitchen, his sense of unease intensified. The kitchen door leading to the backyard swung slightly ajar, letting in faint whiffs of humid summer air. Ryan's gaze darted to a coffee cup on the kitchen counter, abandoned mid-sip, the remnants of the brew still dark and aromatic. Her phone was conspicuously absent from its usual charging station near the fridge. Something was definitely wrong now, no question about it. The nagging fear that had driven Ryan to her house earlier that day was hardening into raw panic. Then he saw it. The first undeniable sign that something terrible had happened. Just beyond the threshold leading to the back hallway lay a dark, ominous trail of smudges against the hardwood floor. His heart pounded as he took a shaky step closer. It was blood, unmistakably blood. The narrow streaks led from the middle of the hallway toward the basement stairs, trailing off into the unknown depths below. Ryan's legs felt heavy as he followed the trail to the basement door, his breath catching when he saw faint smears on the doorknob. 1,000 thoughts rushed through his head, each one more horrifying than the last. He reached for the knob but paused, overwhelmed by dread. If Jessica was hurt, or worse, he wasn't ready to face it. Not alone. Summoning his courage, he twisted the knob and pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The stairs creaked underfoot as Ryan descended cautiously into the basement. The dim light from a single bulb overhead revealed a heart-stopping sight. At the base of the steps lay Jessica, sprawled on her stomach as if she had fallen mid-flight. Blood pooled around her head, dark and viscous against the concrete floor, its metallic scent thick in the close air. Her left hand was clenched tightly, gripping strands of hair later determined to be not her own. Her pajamas, simple, light blue, contrasted hauntingly against the deep red staining the stairs. Ryan froze, his throat tightening and his vision blurring as the reality of the scene overwhelmed him. He couldn't say how long he stood there, seconds, minutes. It didn't matter. Everything was surreal, incomprehensible. He managed to stagger backward, dragging himself up the steps and out of the house as if it might swallow him whole if he stayed any longer. By the time he stumbled into the front yard, his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely dial 911. "My girlfriend, she's been attacked," he stammered, when the dispatcher picked up. His voice cracked as he gave Jessica's address. "There's blood everywhere, I don't think she's alive." The call, placed at 2:07 p.m., marked the official start of the investigation, and Auburn's descent into collective unease. As police and paramedics rushed to the scene, the town was blissfully unaware of the storm about to engulf it. By the time the first responders arrived, Jessica Miller was already beyond their help. What Ryan had found that day wasn't just the tragic end of a young woman's life. It was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Auburn for years to come. A strange and haunting crime scene. When the first responders arrived at 116 Elmwood Drive, they were greeted by an unassuming two-story house with a neat lawn and freshly painted shutters. It was the kind of home that wouldn't draw much attention. just another quiet residence on a quiet street in a quintessentially quiet town. But what lay inside was anything but ordinary, and the scene that the police found would leave even the most experienced among them grappling with disbelief and confusion. The front door was slightly ajar when the officers entered, retaining the eerie calm that Ryan Carter first described in his 911 call. The living room remained untouched. Cookies and a tall, sweating glass of water still sat on the coffee table. A muted daytime talk show droned on in the background, featuring cheerful hosts chatting about the latest summer fashion trends, a surreal contrast to the grim task awaiting police inside. The kitchen was equally perplexing. To an untrained eye it looked like a snapshot of a typical morning, complete with a coffee cup abandoned mid-sip on the counter. The fridge door was slightly ajar and a box of cereal sat on the counter, suggesting that Jessica had planned to eat breakfast before her day took a deadly turn. But there were small details that hinted at the chaos that had unfolded. A chair slightly pushed away from the table, the faintest smear of blood on the edge of the counter, and most chillingly, the basement door at the end of the hall left slightly ajar, with a crimson streak across the door frame. Investigators descended the wooden stairs to the basement where Jessica's body was discovered, and with each creak of the steps the unsettling weight of the crime grew heavier. The single bulb overhead gave a faint yellowish haze to the room which had now become a crime scene. Jessica Miller lay sprawled at the base of the stairs, her head unnaturally tilted to the side, with blood pooling underneath. It was clear that her death had been violent and sudden, yet it was the finer, chilling details surrounding her that began to paint a more puzzling picture. Jessica was still in her light blue pajama set, suggesting she had been attacked early in the morning, perhaps not long after waking up. In her clenched left hand was a small clump of dark hair, later determined through DNA testing to not belong to her. Her bare feet were bruised, and faint scratch marks adorned the wooden floor near her body, clues investigators read as signs of a struggle. But what caught everyone's attention was the strange condition of the crime scene itself. While it was clear that some sort of altercation had occurred, many parts of the house remained unnervingly untouched. The furniture in the living room was unturned, the walls unscathed by any errant violence. Jessica's belongings, from her purse to her prized collection of notebooks, hadn't been disturbed, and most notably there was no sign of forced entry. Every window in the house was locked from the inside, and the front door had shown no signs of tampering. It was as though the killer had entered the home without any difficulty. Aside from the body and the blood casts splattered across parts of the basement, another clue nagged at law enforcement. Her landline phone, which rested on a small table near the foot of the basement stairs, had fresh blood smeared along its keypad. Police theorized that Jessica may have been trying to call for help during the attack, but was unable to complete the call. The chilling silence of an unreturned cry for help only deepened the tragedy. While conducting a closer examination, investigators pointed out an open window in the kitchen, a seemingly innocuous detail that contrasted with the otherwise locked-down house. Its screen sat propped loosely outside on the grass below, its edges smudged slightly with dirt. The window opened to a narrow alley between Jessica's house and her neighbor's garage, a secluded pocket of space ideal for someone who didn't want to be seen. But this raised even more questions. Had someone slipped inside through the window? If so, who? And why wasn't anything stolen? Valuable items, including jewelry and electronics, were present and intact. Did the attacker know Jessica personally, or was this the work of a stranger? Initial forensic work made the situation murkier rather than clearer. Blood evidence was collected from the scene, most belonging to Jessica, but there were small drops found near the basement door that matched no one in her immediate circle. Later, during Jessica's autopsy, it was confirmed that she had fought violently against her attacker. Scratches were found on her own hands, and one of her fingernails was chipped, likely due to intense struggling. DNA was extracted from beneath her fingernails, perhaps the most damning piece of evidence available, but at the time, it offered investigators no immediate answers. It didn't belong to Ryan Carter, her boyfriend, nor any other men who had connections to her personal life. Adding to the unsettling strangeness of the scene, the murder weapon was notably absent. Jessica had died of fatal blunt force trauma to the head, but no weapon could be found anywhere in the home. Whatever object had left the laceration and fractured portions of her skull had vanished, almost as if the killer had taken it with them, another disturbing clue that hinted at premeditation, or at the very least, a chilling level of calculated effort to avoid detection. Detectives combed through every inch of the house that evening, dusting for fingerprints and cataloging evidence meticulously. Outside, the street filled with silent, wide-eyed neighbors peeking through curtains and murmuring quietly to one another. The sight of yellow caution tape stretched across the lawn and police vehicles crowding Elmwood Drive was alien in Auburn, a town used to headlines about bake sales and festivals instead of murder investigations. What stood out most to detectives on that first day was the nagging knowledge that nothing about the scene screamed random. This wasn't a sloppy burglary gone awry. There was no chaotic ransacking and no opportunistic grab for valuables. To the investigators, the scene felt deeply personal, calculated, even intimate. It was the first clue that this case would be anything but simple. The strange, haunting nature of Jessica's death cast a long shadow over Auburn, and as more details emerged, residents would begin to question everything they thought they knew about their quiet little town. Obscure clues. As the investigation into Jessica Miller's tragic death unfolded, authorities found themselves entangled in a web of uncertain evidence, unconfirmed theories, and perplexing details. Auburn, a town unaccustomed to such horrors, watched anxiously as detectives combed through the scene and pieced together the fragile puzzle. What they uncovered, however, did not provide the clarity they needed. Instead, it deepened the mystery. Jessica's cause of death was determined to be a fatal blow to the head, inflicted with a blunt object. The wounds were severe, with the autopsy revealing skull fractures and brain trauma that would have caused near-instant death. However, the murder weapon was conspicuously absent. The object used to end Jessica's life had either been removed from the scene or hidden so cleverly that multiple searches yielded no sign of it. Without the weapon, investigators were left guessing. Was it a familiar household object, or had the attacker brought it with them, further signaling premeditation? Another challenge was the precise timing of the crime. Forensic analysis placed Jessica's estimated time of death between 8:30 and 9 a.m., a brief window that left many unanswered questions. Jessica had been preparing breakfast. Her unfinished coffee lingered on the counter, while a box of cereal sat near her favorite bowl. It was clear she hadn't anticipated anything unusual, but how could such a violent and fatal altercation remain undetected on a calm Saturday morning? Neighbors, when questioned, insisted they hadn't heard anything, and in a town as quiet as Auburn, even the faintest commotion would normally draw attention. Investigators tried to reconstruct Jessica's morning in hopes of uncovering clues to her final moments, but so much remained elusive. Her phone logs showed no unusual calls or texts before her death, and security cameras from nearby intersections captured nothing suspicious. Police confirmed there had been no signs of forced entry, raising the chilling possibility that Jessica might have known her attacker and willingly let them in, or worse, that the person had access to her home through some other means. The open kitchen window was scrutinized, its screen removed and left on the grass outside. Should they assume the killer entered through it, or was it an intentional red herring designed to mislead? Adding to the complexity were the physical traces Jessica left behind, faint but significant. Her fingernails were a key focus of the forensic team, several were chipped, and fragments of DNA were discovered beneath them. These small flecks of genetic material hinted at a desperate physical struggle. Investigators concluded that Jessica had fought back and scratched her attacker, likely causing injury. But this glimmer of hope quickly turned murky. When the DNA results came back, the evidence didn't match anyone closely connected to Jessica. Not her boyfriend Ryan Carter, her co-workers, or even extended friends and family. It was an anomaly, a lead that seemed to lead nowhere. If the DNA didn't link to someone in her immediate circle, was this a stranger after all? Or was it an omission in their growing list of suspects? Doubt also grew around the subtle signs of disturbance in the house. The smudges of blood leading to the basement told part of the story, but what about the overturned table in the living room or the streaks on the kitchen counter? To some, they suggested Jessica had fought her attacker not just in the basement, but throughout the house. Others argued they could have been staged, details planted intentionally by the murderer to confuse investigators. One particularly haunting discovery was the blood-stained landline phone found in the basement. The phone was unplugged and had blood smeared across its keypad. Police believed Jessica had tried to use it during the attack, her last attempt to call for help. Yet, being unable to complete that call, left the team with a painful reminder of how close she had come to reaching safety. They scoured her cell phone records as well, searching for clues in her past conversations, but nothing there illuminated any danger she might have been in prior to that fateful morning. Despite these few fragments of evidence, no glaring motive surfaced. Jessica appeared to lead an optimistic, uncomplicated life. Friends and colleagues described her as warm, honest, and hardworking, someone who was more likely to help those in need than create conflict. Although she had no known enemies, investigators couldn't discount the possibility of hidden tensions. The notion that someone in her circle could harbor jealousy, resentments, or romantic obsession became an avenue detectives explored. But who, and why? Even Ryan Carter, Jessica's boyfriend, fell under scrutiny. His discovery of the body and his frantic 911 call placed him front and center in the investigation. At first, nothing linked him to the crime, his alibi checked out, and the DNA under Jessica's nails excluded him. But investigators couldn't help but notice small inconsistencies in his statements. He admitted to trying to call Jessica repeatedly that morning, but phone records revealed longer gaps between calls than he described. More puzzlingly, his clothes and shoes that day were immaculately clean, a discrepancy that raised eyebrows since many felt the scene would have been impossible to leave without some blood contamination. Ryan insisted he hadn't touched anything in the basement, a claim police debated behind closed doors. Still, no piece of evidence conclusively tied Ryan or anyone else to the crime. The investigation felt like chasing shadows. Evidence that should have revealed answers only raised more questions. Strands of hair Jessica had clutched in her final moments, the untraced blood drops near the basement door, the elusive murder weapon, all of it painted a fragmented, cryptic portrait of her final struggle. For Auburn, the lack of clarity was agonizing. Rumors began weaving their way across lawns and park benches. Suspicions grew, dividing a community that had once trusted its own without question. People locked their doors now, conversations felt guarded, heavy with subtext. The chilling truth of Jessica Miller's murder wasn't just that it happened, but that it remained unsolved, with only vague, spectral clues haunting everyone who sought the truth. Ryan Carter becomes a suspect. In the days following Jessica Miller's tragic death, emotions ran high in Auburn. Shock gave way to grief, and grief quickly morphed into an insatiable desire for answers. For the residents of this small town, the pressing question wasn't just who could have committed such an atrocious act, but why. As human nature often dictates in such situations, the person closest to the victim came under intense scrutiny. Ryan Carter, Jessica's boyfriend of 3 years. At first, Ryan was treated as a grieving loved one. His 911 call, trembling voice, and visible distress when police arrived all seemed to underscore his innocence. Witnesses recounted seeing him sitting on the curb outside Jessica's house, his head in his hands, while officers secured the perimeter. He was described as distraught, mumbling incoherently about how this could have happened. Local media, too, initially portrayed him as a broken man who had stumbled upon the unimaginable. But beneath the surface of his sorrow, investigators began noticing inconsistencies in Ryan's account of the day. At first, he told police he had tried to contact Jessica throughout the morning but assumed she was sleeping in after a long work week. While that explanation seemed valid at the time, when officers reviewed his phone records, they noticed irregularities. His calls to Jessica were far fewer than he claimed, often spaced apart by hours instead of minutes as he had described. For seasoned investigators, this slight discrepancy raised a red flag. Why exaggerate if he had nothing to hide? Ryan's story continued to unravel under closer examination. The timeline he provided, waking up at 7 a.m., sending work emails until 10 a.m., running errands, and then heading to Jessica's house around 2 p.m., seemed plausible at first. But when police obtained digital evidence, they found his alibi wasn't as airtight as he had suggested. His laptop was indeed used to send emails that morning, but the timestamps didn't fully align with his account. There were gaps that couldn't be explained away as innocent distractions. The more the investigation focused on Ryan, the more perplexing details emerged. Perhaps the most damning piece of circumstantial evidence was his seemingly unblemished appearance upon arrival at the crime scene. According to police reports, Ryan showed no signs of physical struggle or contamination. His clothes were pristine, his hands unmarked, and his shoes squeaky clean, a peculiar observation given the bloodied mess in Jessica's basement. Officers who had combed through the scene remarked that it seemed almost impossible for someone to step into the house, much less discover a body in the basement, without being affected in some physical way. When questioned about this, Ryan shrugged uncomfortably and suggested he hadn't touched anything. "I just froze the moment I saw her," he said, but investigators weren't convinced. Something didn't sit right. Adding to the unease were Ryan's shifting emotions during interviews. While many grieving individuals fluctuate between sorrow and composure, Ryan's mood swings struck detectives as extreme. At one moment he'd be crying inconsolably, recounting his love for Jessica and their plans to get married. The next he'd be detached and clinical, speculating about potential motives for her murder. To some of the officers in the room, his behavior felt staged, as though he were trying to perform grief rather than authentically experiencing it. The autopsy results and forensic findings further complicated Ryan's position. DNA evidence recovered from under Jessica's fingernails did not match Ryan, which could have exonerated him. But investigators struggled to ignore other incriminating details. For example, Jessica's blood was found in smudges on the edge of the living room sofa, a curious find given Ryan claimed to have stayed away from the crime scene as much as possible. Fingerprints matching Ryan were detected on Jessica's landline phone in the basement, the same phone investigators believed Jessica had desperately tried to use for help during the attack. Ryan claimed he had never entered the basement that day, but the physical evidence painted a different picture. Then came the discovery on Ryan's personal devices, which tipped public perception decisively against him. Police examining his laptop uncovered numerous photos of Jessica that were clearly taken without her knowledge. Many of these images, captured through her bedroom window at public parks or even at her workplace, seemed troublingly invasive. It was unclear whether Jessica was aware of the extent of Ryan's obsession, but the photographs painted a chilling portrait of someone who might have been overly possessive or even controlling. Text messages between the pair, extracted from Jessica's phone, hinted at recent arguments, though nothing severe enough to suggest violence. Still, this newfound picture of Ryan as a boyfriend harboring obsessive tendencies only further fueled suspicion. The proverbial nail in the coffin for Ryan's public image came when a neighbor came forward, describing an unusual sighting the morning of Jessica's murder. According to the witness, Ryan's silver sedan had been parked across the street from Jessica's house for several hours that Saturday morning, far earlier than Ryan claimed to have arrived. When confronted with this account, Ryan wavered, initially denying it before stammering something about running errands nearby. For detectives, this inconsistency felt like more than nervous confusion. It felt like deception. Heavy suspicion fell on Ryan as the days stretched into weeks. But despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, no definitive proof linked him directly to the act of murder. The DNA didn't match. The murder weapon was missing. There was no video footage, no witness placing him inside the house at the time of the crime. For prosecutors, Ryan represented the perfect storm of suspicion without resolution. While he was undeniably a person of interest, there were still significant gaps in the case, enough to keep him hovering in a gray area of law enforcement's focus. To Ryan's friends, he was a victim of misfortune, a grieving partner wrongfully accused in the vacuum of real answers. But to others in Auburn, he had already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Gossip swirled about his past, his motives, his temperament. Rumors painted him as possessive, controlling, and prone to jealousy, accusations that found fertile ground in the wake of Jessica's death. Ultimately, Ryan Carter's life became as much a story of tragedy as it was of suspicion. The emotional whiplash of losing his girlfriend, coupled with the unshakable cloud of being a suspect, left him a broken man. He expressed outrage at law enforcement for trying to frame him, while repeatedly pleading his innocence to anyone who would listen. But questions lingered everywhere he went. For many in Auburn, Ryan wasn't simply the young man overcome with grief who had discovered Jessica's tragic end. He was also the man who might have been standing in the shadows, holding the proverbial smoking gun. DNA evidence and scattered clues. As the case against Ryan Carter, or any potential suspect, continued to grow more murky, the presence of DNA evidence introduced both hope and frustration for investigators. DNA, often seen as the silver bullet in modern crime solving, wielded the potential to break the case wide open, or throw it deeper into uncertainty. In Jessica Miller's tragic murder, the unique combination of forensic findings posed more questions than answers, leaving detectives walking a razor-thin line between breakthroughs and dead ends. The most significant discovery during the crime scene analysis was the DNA found underneath Jessica's fingernails. It was clear that in her final moments, Jessica had fought her attacker with everything she had. Her chipped nails, the faint scratch marks found on furniture and walls near her body, and the strands of unfamiliar dark hair clenched in her left hand all pointed to a violent struggle. Every detail seemed to confirm that Jessica's instincts had been to resist, to leave evidence behind, even in her dying moments. What detectives needed now was to determine whose DNA had been left under her nails, a clue Jessica herself had unknowingly preserved. The crime lab worked tirelessly to extract and analyze the genetic material from her fingernails. When the results finally came in, the findings were perplexing. The DNA did not belong to her boyfriend Ryan Carter, nor did it match any profiles derived from her close circle of family, friends, co-workers, or acquaintances. It was an unknown profile, one with no match in the national DNA database. It wasn't the breakthrough investigators had hoped for, it was a mystery that further complicated the case. Forensic evidence became a tantalizing puzzle. People who knew Jessica intimately were ruled out one by one, based on DNA results. Even when detectives expanded their scope to include people she had interacted with in passing, such as delivery workers and distant acquaintances, no match appeared. It began to feel as if the DNA belonged to a ghost. The implications of this discovery were chilling. If the DNA under Jessica's nails didn't match anyone in her immediate life, a new possibility emerged. It could belong to a stranger. This suggested that Auburn's serene facade may have been permanently shattered by an outsider who somehow invaded its fabric of trust. But then the question arose, why Jessica? Why pick a vibrant, beloved young woman in a safe suburban neighborhood as the target? Investigators couldn't ignore the deeply unsettling possibility that the act of violence had been random, a crime of opportunity. Yet, if it was random, the precision and apparent lack of evidence left behind by the attacker were baffling. Criminals acting on impulse rarely leave such tidy crime scenes. Adding to this was the ambiguity of the hair clutched in Jessica's hand. Microscopic analysis confirmed it didn't belong to her, not surprising given its dark color as Jessica had light brown hair. This clump of hair, along with the DNA beneath her nails, pointed to an unknown individual in the house that morning, someone who had escaped without a trace. The strands were analyzed for genetic material, but despite the promising lead, the lab tests offered no progress due to degradation in the hair's follicular structure. Without this match, detectives were once again looking at evidence that stopped just shy of providing answers. The crime scene itself seemed to further complicate the picture. Small drops of blood were found near the basement door, clearly not Jessica's. Tests identified it as belonging to an unknown person, the same individual whose DNA was found under her nails. The presence of these blood droplets turned the idea of a random break-in on its head. The attacker had gotten injured. Investigators theorized that Jessica had fought back so aggressively that she may have inflicted wounds on the killer before succumbing to her injuries. However, despite these clues, no reports of anyone seeking medical attention for unexplained injuries aired in nearby hospitals or clinics. The attacker had either avoided attention altogether, or had disappeared from the area entirely. The complexity grew even deeper when considering the crime scene's contradictory details. Beyond the DNA evidence, there was the peculiar absence of any physical signs connecting Ryan Carter, the primary suspect, to the scenario outlined by the forensics team. Blood spatter patterns indicated a chaotic and brutal altercation, particularly near the base of the stairs where Jessica's body was found. The handrails and steps were marked with droplets and streaks, a story of resistance echoed in every turn of the scene. Yet, Ryan's white t-shirt and jeans, untouched by even the faintest trace of blood, left everyone confused. Was this an indication of his innocence, or a deliberate attempt to sanitize himself before calling the police? Investigators also struggled to reconcile the limited physical evidence of forced entry. The open kitchen window with its removed screen felt staged. Dirt smudges along the window frame suggested someone could have entered that way, but there were no shoe prints, fingerprints, or other evidence to corroborate the theory. The back door and every window in the house, apart from the one in the kitchen, remained locked. These conflicting details created an unsettling portrait of an attacker who had inexplicably gained entry without leaving clear signs of how. Meanwhile, the evidence connecting Ryan to moments before and after the crime presented another layer of confusion. Smudged fingerprints on Jessica's basement landline added suspicion to his story. Investigators believed Jessica had tried to use the phone during the attack, leaving bloody marks on its keypad. How then did Ryan's prints end up on the same phone if he claimed never to have gone near her body? Ryan struggled to explain this during interviews, further straining his relationship with the police. His only response repeated, "I froze when I saw her, I don't remember touching anything." And then there was one haunting reality that clung like fog to the case: the missing murder weapon. Jessica had died from blunt force trauma to the head, a fatal blow delivered with a heavy blunt object that fractured her skull. The crime scene had been combed exhaustively for clues, from the obvious to the obscure, yet the weapon had seemingly vanished. Investigators speculated that the attacker had deliberately taken it with them when they fled. This type of deliberate concealment suggested calculation, not impulse. Was the killer someone controlled enough to plan their escape methodically or simply lucky in covering their tracks? As news of the perplexing DNA evidence and scattered clues reached the public, Auburn's sense of safety continued to erode. Friends whispered behind shuttered windows. Parents ushered their children home before sunset. For a tight-knit town like Auburn, often built on trust and familiarity, the presence of an unknown entity tied to Jessica's death sent shockwaves of uncertainty. The fragments of evidence hinted at a clearer narrative but refused to provide an answer, casting a long and unsettling shadow over the investigation. Months later, as detectives revisited the DNA findings and reviewed witness interviews, the pieces of the puzzle felt stubbornly out of place. Every small clue carried weight, but each came with a question mark. Who was the person Jessica fought so fiercely against? Whose blood rested near the basement door? Where did the murder weapon go? And perhaps most troubling of all, would the DNA ever match anyone, or would it remain the ghostly fingerprint of an unanswered tragedy? A new figure emerges in the story. As the investigation into Jessica Miller's murder stretched on with little resolution, the intricate web of evidence began to widen, and the police started looking further afield for answers. While Ryan Carter remained the primary focus of the investigation, a new lead was about to shake the narrative. This lead didn't come from fingerprints or forensics. It came from the observations of an alert neighbor, an ordinary person who had witnessed something all too easy to overlook at first glance, but critical in what was to come. Approximately 1 week after Jessica's death, a middle-aged woman named Cheryl Matthews, who lived 2 houses down from Jessica on Elmwood Drive, approached investigators with her own recollections. Cheryl had been hesitant to come forward earlier, not wanting to get involved in what she called police business. But after days of sleepless nights and a mounting sense of unease, she decided that what she had seen could no longer be ignored. Cheryl recounted that she had noticed a black bicycle parked near Jessica's driveway early on the morning of the murder. In a town like Auburn, bicycles leaned against fences or porches were common sights, but this bicycle stood out. For one, it was unchained and left unattended, perched precariously as though its rider had left in a rush. Cheryl thought it strange at the time but ultimately shrugged it off, assuming it belonged to one of Jessica's friends or a passerby. However, as details about the murder surfaced, her memory of that black bicycle refused to fade. She described it as a men's model. It had thick, rugged tires and a scuffed frame that looked worn from heavy use. There was a woven basket mounted to the front handlebars, slightly crooked with faded yellow paint. What made this piece of information particularly significant was the mention of the bike's design. Detective Sam Bennett, one of the lead investigators, immediately recognized the description as matching a bicycle known to belong to Eric Duncan, a co-worker of Jessica's. Eric worked with Jessica at a local law firm in Auburn, where Jessica had been gaining recognition as a rising star for her sharp intellect and courtroom poise. Eric, in stark contrast, fit the stereotype of the underachieving employee planning to simply ride it out until retirement. He was described by colleagues as decent enough but reclusive, often keeping to himself during lunch breaks and staff events. Eric Duncan became a focal point of discussion almost instantly. The fact that his black bicycle might have been spotted near Jessica's home on the morning of her murder was enough to pique the interest of the investigative team. It raised an unsettling possibility. Had Eric been at Jessica's house that morning, and if so, why? Was it merely an innocent visit, or had it turned into something far more sinister? Detectives dug into Eric's background and quickly uncovered a handful of peculiar details that only deepened their suspicion. First and most notably, Eric owned a home just 4 blocks away from Jessica's and was known to frequently ride his bike to work or to run errands. Second, interviews with co-workers painted a complicated picture of Jessica and Eric's relationship. While most described their interactions as cordial, a few mentioned that Eric occasionally exhibited an uncomfortable admiration for Jessica. He had once referred to her as perfection personified during a casual office conversation, a remark that now seemed oddly foreboding in hindsight. Perhaps most troubling of all were murmurs of an incident a month earlier. According to a fellow co-worker, Emily Carr, Jessica had confided in her about an unsettling run-in with Eric. During a late night at work, as Jessica stayed behind to finish a case file, Eric had shown up unannounced, despite having left for the day hours earlier. Jessica reportedly found him standing in the break room, motionless, staring out the window with a cup of coffee in hand. Eric had seemed startled by her presence, fumbling for an excuse about forgetting something at his desk, but the exchange left Jessica uneasy. As Emily remembered, Jessica had joked about it the next day, making light of what she described as an odd encounter with the office ghost, but now the memory carried a far darker undertone. Armed with the insight provided by Cheryl Matthews, detectives brought Eric in for questioning. He appeared nervous but composed, fidgeting with a paperclip he'd found on the table in the interrogation room. When asked about the whereabouts of his bicycle on the morning of August 18th, the day of Jessica's murder, Eric paused uncomfortably. He claimed he rode the bike to the nearby grocery store that morning to pick up dog food and a newspaper, but when pressed for a receipt, he stammered out an excuse about forgetting to ask for one. Detectives quickly corroborated this with the store. There was no evidence that Eric had been there. Adding to their suspicions, Eric's alibi became even shakier when they visited his home. The bicycle Cheryl had described wasn't lying casually in the garage or porch as expected. It was missing entirely. Eric maintained that it had been stolen a couple of days prior, a claim he insisted was coincidental and unrelated to the investigation. Yet when police pressed him about why he hadn't reported such a theft, Eric fell silent, visibly struggling to come up with a plausible answer. Forensic investigators searched Eric's house hoping to uncover any connecting evidence. Fibers, hair, DNA samples, anything. And while they didn't immediately find direct proof of guilt, one damning detail emerged. During a search of Eric's possessions, officers discovered a crumpled envelope that had once contained a handwritten letter from the firm's stationery, addressed to Jessica. Though its intent remained unclear, the letter brimmed with overly flattering language about undeniable brilliance and unmatched radiance. While it wasn't enough to directly implicate Eric in the crime, it painted a disturbing picture of a man potentially obsessed. At the same time, Cheryl Matthews' black bicycle lead began rippling through the small town of Auburn. Speculation spread fast. It didn't take long for word to reach the streets that Eric Duncan's name had entered the fray. Neighbors theorized endlessly about his motives, some recounting their own eerie observations of him biking around at all hours. Others defended him as a harmless introvert who wouldn't hurt a fly. The case wasn't clear-cut, nor did the connection to Eric provide immediate answers, but detectives couldn't discount the possibility that he didn't just admire Jessica from afar, but might have acted on that admiration in the most tragic way imaginable. Whether Eric Duncan was another dead end or the key to unraveling the case, one thing was certain. The quiet town of Auburn wasn't as idyllic as it seemed, and the shadows cast by Jessica's murder seemed to stretch much farther than anyone had anticipated. Controversial theories. As the investigation into Jessica Miller's murder stretched into months without a definitive conclusion, theories began to swirl among law enforcement, media, and the increasingly restless residents of Auburn. With the case entangled in contradictions and a lack of definitive evidence, debates over what truly happened began to take on a life of their own. Theories ranged from plausible to wild, creating a swirling storm of controversy that only further muddied the waters in the search for justice. 1. Ryan Carter, the scorned lover. The most debated theory centered around Jessica's boyfriend, Ryan Carter. Despite his initial depiction as a heartbroken young man who had stumbled upon the lifeless body of his girlfriend, doubt had crept in on multiple fronts. Many believed that Ryan possessed the most obvious motive: jealousy. Text messages extracted from Jessica's phone revealed that they'd had arguments in the weeks leading to her death, mostly centered on Ryan feeling neglected or unappreciated. A few pointed out how his obsessive behaviors, such as secretly photographing Jessica through her window, painted him as a controlling boyfriend driven by a need for dominance. Supporters of this theory argued that Ryan's reaction to Jessica's death seemed overly rehearsed or exaggerated. His immaculately clean appearance after having reportedly discovered her in a bloodied basement raised more than a few eyebrows among detectives in the community. Add to that the physical evidence of fingerprints on the basement phone he swore he'd never touched, and it didn't take long for a narrative to emerge. Perhaps Ryan had snapped in a fit of rage during yet another argument, and then attempted to cover his tracks. However, defenders of Ryan questioned the feasibility of this theory. His DNA was not found under Jessica's nails, which had clearly scraped her attacker. Ryan's alibi, although scrutinized, still placed him far away from Jessica's house during her estimated time of death. Where was the physical evidence tying him to the murder scene? And perhaps the largest hole in the theory, what possible reason would Ryan have to go to such extremes when all accounts suggest he truly loved Jessica and had even hinted at proposing to her soon? For many, the case against Ryan didn't quite add up. 2. Eric Duncan, the obsessed co-worker. A second theory gained traction following the emergence of Eric Duncan, Jessica's enigmatic co-worker. To those who believed in his guilt, Eric represented an archetype often portrayed in crime dramas. A quiet, socially awkward man harboring unspoken infatuation that eventually turned dark. Details about Eric's interactions with Jessica came under intense scrutiny. The letter found in his home, full of odd and overly poetic praises for her, struck many as the writings of an admirer who had crossed the line into obsession. Incidents of Eric showing up unannounced and his black bicycle allegedly being spotted near Jessica's house heightened suspicion. What deepened the theory was Cheryl Matthews' claim about the mystery bike near Jessica's driveway on the morning of the murder, which bore a striking resemblance to Eric's. Furthermore, Eric had no solid alibi for that time frame, and his shaky answers during questioning only fueled speculation. For those who believed in his guilt, the narrative seemed straightforward. Eric's obsessive feelings for Jessica had either been rejected or remained unacknowledged for too long, and something on that fateful morning caused him to explode in a crime of passion. However, this theory had its weaknesses. DNA and physical evidence from the crime scene, including the hair Jessica clutched and the blood droplets in the basement, had yet to connect Eric to the scene directly. Detectives never found Eric's bicycle, as he claimed it had been stolen days earlier. Investigators couldn't prove whether his apparent admiration of Jessica had ever escalated into dangerous territory or whether it was merely harmless eccentricity. For all they knew, Eric could have simply been framed by bad timing and an unusual personality. 3. The random intruder. A stranger in the night. Out of all the theories, the idea of a completely random perpetrator struck the deepest fear into the hearts of Auburn residents. The notion that a stranger, perhaps a drifter or someone passing through the quiet town with dark intentions, had been the one to enter Jessica's home, upended people's sense of safety in their idyllic town. Under this theory, investigators speculated that Jessica had been targeted as an easy victim, someone home alone whose routine or vulnerability had been observed by a prowler lurking in the shadows. The open kitchen window and removed screen added weight to this idea. It inferred an entry point, as though someone had slipped into her house while she was enjoying her morning coffee, entirely unaware of the danger looming behind her. The telltale signs of a struggle indicated Jessica's willingness to fight back, a bravery that possibly injured the attacker, as evidenced by the unidentifiable blood drops at the scene. This theory seemed plausible considering the unknown DNA under Jessica's fingernails and the dark hairs clutched in her hand that didn't belong to anyone in her personal or professional circles. Supporters of the random intruder theory believed that this evidence pointed to an outside entity, someone entirely disconnected from Jessica's life. But even here, questions arose. Why was nothing of value stolen from her home? Why had the attacker cleaned up so meticulously that no other physical fingerprints or shoe prints were found? Random break-ins rarely exhibited the level of order and precision seen in this crime, leaving many wondering if this theory truly held weight. 4. A deliberate setup, framing the innocent. Another theory that ignited furious debates involved the idea that Jessica's murder had been part of a calculated plan to frame someone else for the crime. This theory offered an explanation for why so much evidence felt staged or deliberately confusing. From the open window that may not have even been used to enter the house, to the missing murder weapon, to the smudge of blood on the basement phone, some investigators posited that the crime scene had been manipulated to deflect attention away from the true culprit or create misleading trails. If this were true, it begged the question of whether Ryan, Eric, or some entirely unknown party had planned the crime with the specific purpose of throwing off investigators. Letting suspicion naturally fall on Ryan as the boyfriend or Eric as the odd co-worker could have been part of a broader plan. But framing someone requires intricate planning, and for most in the town, the idea that Jessica's murder involved this level of manipulation felt too far-fetched. The towns divide. As these theories circulated, Auburn found itself bitterly divided. Those who believed in Ryan's guilt clashed with those who saw him as a victim of bad luck and poor circumstances. In contrast, Eric Duncan's defenders pointed to his introverted personality as proof of his harmlessness, leading to arguments with neighbors unsettled by his apparent fixation on Jessica. Meanwhile, those subscribing to the random intruder theory became consumed by fear, locking doors and refusing to let their children play outside. Each person in town carried their own interpretation of the clues, adding their voice to the ever-growing cacophony of speculation. One thing was clear: every theory had its flaws, but every theory also carried enough dark plausibility to keep the case and the community trapped in painful uncertainty. No matter which narrative people believed, the shadow of Jessica Miller's murder loomed large, dividing a once peaceful town in ways no one could have imagined. The legal system under fire. Jessica Miller's murder didn't just devastate her family and friends, it also put Auburn's entire legal system under the spotlight. The prolonged investigation, lack of clear evidence, and bitterly divided public opinions created the perfect storm of controversy. With each passing day, frustration mounted in the community, and as finger-pointing grew rampant, the case shifted into the courtroom, where the judicial process would attempt to make sense of the chaos. But instead of bringing clarity, the legal process only revealed the inherent flaws and limitations of a system ill-prepared to deal with such a high-profile and emotionally charged case. Ryan Carter, Jessica's boyfriend, became the focal point of the trial. Despite ongoing doubts about his guilt, authorities eventually decided that the circumstantial evidence against him was strong enough to move forward with charges. It was a decision that instantly polarized the public. On one hand, many believed Ryan's inconsistent statements, obsessive tendencies, and the awkward details dug up during the investigation painted him as a viable suspect. On the other hand, significant gaps in the evidence, most notably the absence of his DNA at key crime scene locations, pointed to the possibility of his innocence. The trial began in the summer of 2015, drawing national attention. Ryan faced charges of second-degree murder, with prosecutors painting a picture of a jealous and controlling boyfriend who had finally snapped. They argued that Ryan's obsessive love for Jessica had slowly devolved into resentment. The prosecution leaned heavily on the photographs found on Ryan's computer. Pictures of Jessica taken without her consent, some through her bedroom window at night. To the courtroom, these images painted a chilling picture of a man who had crossed the line between love and dangerous obsession. Prosecutors claimed that the images, combined with testimony from neighbors, showed that Ryan was overly possessive and harbored feelings of insecurity about Jessica's success and independence. The state also focused on Ryan's curious behavior at the crime scene. A forensic analyst testified that it would have been virtually impossible for Ryan to enter Jessica's basement and discover her blood-soaked body without some of the blood transferring to his clothes or shoes. Yet Ryan appeared impeccably clean when first responders arrived. While Ryan had claimed he never approached Jessica's body or touched anything in the basement, prosecutors argued that this explanation was implausible. If he truly discovered her lifeless at the foot of the stairs, how could he have left the scene so untouched? But the prosecution's case wasn't bulletproof. It relied almost entirely on circumstantial evidence to tie Ryan to the crime. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness testimony, and no conclusive DNA evidence. The DNA under Jessica's fingernails, which investigators believed belonged to her killer, didn't match Ryan's. Medical examiners testified that the scratches on Jessica's attacker would have drawn blood, yet Ryan showed no injuries in the days following her murder. Meanwhile, the timeline of the crime, pieced together through forensic examinations and phone records, raised significant doubts. Ryan's alibi still placed him away from Jessica's home during the estimated window of her death. Against this backdrop, Ryan's defense team sought to dismantle the prosecution's case. They portrayed Ryan as a devastated young man who had been wrongfully accused simply because he was close to the victim. The defense underscored the lack of physical evidence tying Ryan to the murder scene, and questioned why investigators had focused so heavily on him despite numerous unanswered questions. "We have DNA evidence from an unidentified person at the scene," Ryan's attorney argued during opening statements. And yet, instead of exhausting all avenues to find them, law enforcement zeroed in on Ryan because he was an easy target, her boyfriend. That's not justice, that's negligence. The defense also highlighted the possibility of other suspects, particularly Eric Duncan, Jessica's co-worker. They pointed to testimonies about Eric's unusual behavior leading up to the murder, and the fact that his black bicycle, a potential piece of evidence, had mysteriously gone missing around the time of Jessica's death. While Eric's DNA also didn't match the samples found under Jessica's nails, the The defense argued that investigators had not done enough to rule him out as a suspect or expand their search for other potential perpetrators. As the trial unfolded, emotions ran high in the courtroom and across Auburn. Jessica's parents sat stoically during proceedings, their grief palpable as their daughter's personal life was dissected in front of lawyers, journalists, and onlookers. Ryan's family, equally devastated, vehemently maintained his innocence, accusing the justice system of rushing to find a scapegoat rather than following the facts. Meanwhile, public opinion outside the courthouse remained sharply divided. Some residents called for Ryan's conviction, citing their belief that his lack of an alibi and his obsessive behavior showed his true nature. Others, however, felt the trial was nothing more than a witch hunt, with Ryan being unfairly targeted in the absence of solid evidence. In the end, the trial reached a controversial climax. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Ryan Carter guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict was met with both relief and outrage. Supporters of Jessica's family felt justice had finally been served, while Ryan's defenders argued the case was deeply flawed and driven by emotional bias rather than hard evidence. Ryan was sentenced to 25 years in prison, leaving him and his legal team to vow to fight the conviction through appeals. Yet despite the conclusion of the trial, many lingering questions remained unanswered. The unidentified DNA under Jessica's nails and the blood droplets belonging to an unknown individual painted an unsettling picture of a crime that was perhaps not as clear-cut as the jury had decided. Who did the DNA belong to? Why was the murder weapon never found? Could the true killer still be out there, walking free while Ryan served time for a crime he may not have committed? The conviction shone a harsh light on the limitations of the justice system, particularly in cases where evidence is contradictory or incomplete. While some believed the trial had delivered justice for Jessica, others saw it as a troubling example of how circumstantial evidence can be used to convict someone without definitive proof. The case became a haunting reminder of how imperfect the system can be and how justice sometimes feels elusive, even when a verdict is reached. For Auburn, the trial left a lasting scar. Residents debated not just Ryan's guilt or innocence, but also whether their small-town trust had been irreparably broken. Parents warned their children to be cautious, doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted tightly, and whispers of doubt lingered in every conversation. The legal process may have provided an answer, but it was one that left everyone questioning how much they could truly rely on their justice system to find the truth in a sea of uncertainty. A community divided. The conviction of Ryan Carter for the murder of Jessica Miller should have brought a semblance of closure to Auburn, but instead it sparked a maelstrom of controversy. The trial didn't resolve the small-town tragedy, it amplified it, sending shockwaves through a community already reeling from fear and speculation. Divisions emerged like deep gashes among neighbors, friends, and even families as people took sides either for or against Ryan's guilt. What began as a shared tragedy evolved into a battleground of opinions, where every conversation seemed to play out in the shadow of Jessica's death. The case against Ryan, relief or haste? For some in Auburn, Ryan Carter's conviction felt like the inevitable and necessary resolution to the nightmare that had torn their quiet town apart. Many saw Ryan as the only logical suspect, a man whose obsessive behavior had gone unchecked until it culminated in an act of violence. The photographs discovered on his laptop, intimate images of Jessica taken without her knowledge, especially alarmed this faction of the town. To them, the pictures were chilling proof of a man bent on controlling a woman who no longer fit neatly into the narrative he wanted for their relationship. Supporters of the conviction pointed out Ryan's strange emotional swings during the trial, his inconsistent statements, and the unnerving details revealed about his and Jessica's final weeks together. "It's sad," one local resident explained in an interview with the Auburn Gazette, "but love can drive people to do terrible things. The signs were all there. Why are people still doubting it?" For these residents, the court and jury had done the right thing. Ryan had been found guilty not just by evidence but by common sense. Jealousy, especially in a relationship beginning to fracture, was reason enough in their eyes. But not everyone agreed that the resolution felt right. Ryan's supporters, who vehemently believed in his innocence, argued that circumstantial evidence and police bias had railroaded a grieving boyfriend into becoming the ultimate scapegoat. For them, it seemed that Jessica's death had become a grim game of someone must pay, and Ryan had the misfortune of being the easiest target. The lack of concrete DNA evidence tying him to the crime scene remained their rallying cry. One of Ryan's supporters, an old friend of his from high school, was quoted saying, "If there's unknown DNA at the scene, not his DNA, then how is he guilty? Isn't that supposed to matter?" Eric Duncan, an unresolved shadow. Adding further controversy was the theory that Eric Duncan, Jessica's introverted co-worker, was the real culprit. A growing wave of townspeople, skeptical of Ryan's conviction, began to shift blame to the quiet and deeply private man whose fascination with Jessica raised eyebrows during the investigation. These critics pointed to the discovery of the poetic letter in Eric's home and Cheryl Matthews' testimony about the black bicycle outside Jessica's house on the morning of her murder. Eric had reasons to feel slighted by Jessica, some theorized. Maybe she threatened to make his behavior known, and he couldn't handle the humiliation. For many, the fact that Eric's alibi never held water and his bicycle conveniently went missing just before the crime created a compelling reason to question why more hadn't been done to draw him into the fold as a prime suspect. Others added that his awkward mannerisms and solitary routines had made him an easy figure for people to dismiss, at least until it was too late. Eric, however, also had supporters. Neighbors painted him as odd and reclusive but ultimately incapable of murder. "He's a little different, sure, but that doesn't mean he killed her," said one co-worker when questioned years later. To his defenders, Eric was being scapegoated because he didn't fit Auburn's idea of the typical friendly small-town resident. They argued that people's suspicions of him said more about prejudice toward introverts than about hard facts. The ghost in the evidence. While opinions of Ryan and Eric dominated much of the public debate, an unsettling number of residents focused on another possibility: the theory of a random intruder. For many, the unknown DNA under Jessica's nails, the unfamiliar hair clutched in her hand, and the blood droplets from an unidentified individual painted a vivid portrait of an assailant who had no ties to anyone in Auburn. To these residents, neither Ryan nor Eric belonged behind bars. Instead, some stranger, someone whose face no one in Auburn had seen, was responsible for Jessica's horrifying death. This theory rattled the town's confidence in its safety. Parents who once let their children roam freely down the tree-lined streets now kept them close. Outsiders visiting small bakeries or antique shops were met with suspicious glances, as locals looked for any sign that a stranger might have motives darker than looking for local charm. Reports of prowlers, even unfounded ones, skyrocketed in the months following Ryan's conviction, creating a sense of paranoia that hung heavy over Auburn. Still, skeptics of the random intruder theory saw it as a reach, an effort to explain away uncomfortable realities. "Small-town America likes to think big-city problems are brought by big-city people," a vocal supporter of Ryan's conviction remarked outside a community fundraiser. But let's face it, even here, killers don't just come out of nowhere. Jessica knew her attacker. End of story. Communities turned against each other. What made the controversy unbearable for Auburn wasn't just the endless speculation but the personal rifts it created between its residents. Friends stopped talking after heated debates. Longtime neighbors, once close-knit, eyed each other suspiciously, unsure whether they could trust one another's judgment. Families found themselves arguing at dinner tables, some defending Ryan's innocence, others condemning him for what they believed was an obvious crime. Even community institutions like churches and school events weren't spared from the divide. It used to feel like this town moved as one big family, an elder at Auburn Community Church shared in a local feature. Now it feels like there are battle lines drawn down every block. Everyone's accusing somebody else of being blind, of not seeing what's right in front of them. Nobody's talking, everyone's arguing. Local businesses also found themselves swept into the fray. Cafes and diners once bustling with friendly conversation found their regulars now huddled quietly in corners, wary of saying too much in case they exposed their views. Some business owners complained that the town's uneasy air was scaring away visitors, further damaging Auburn's small-town charm. Whispers of doubt. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the divided opinions surrounding Jessica's murder was the lasting cloud of doubt. With lingering gaps in the evidence and unanswered questions about the crime, few felt truly satisfied. Even those certain of Ryan's guilt worried about the unidentified DNA, murmuring quiet prayers that law enforcement hadn't simply settled out of desperation. Those who believed in the theory of an outsider killing Jessica grappled with guilt over how poorly Auburn handled its own fears, how quickly they'd turned suspicions inward instead of looking beyond their community for answers. Jessica Miller's murder wasn't just an event. It became a scar that Auburn would wear for decades to come. Ryan Carter sat in prison, labeled a murderer, but not without a contingent of townsfolk rallying behind his innocence. Eric Duncan, haunted by the whispers of suspicion, lived under a quiet shadow for years. The specter of Jessica's unsolved questions became an unsettling undercurrent that Auburn couldn't shake, as new generations grew up hearing the story, a chilling reminder that even in the smallest towns, trust can fracture beyond repair. A case without closure. Despite Ryan Carter serving time for murdering Jessica Miller, many unanswered questions about her death continue to haunt Auburn. The conviction brought legal resolution, but it did little to dispel the lingering uncertainty surrounding the case. In many ways, Jessica's tragic end became less of a closed file and more of an unsolvable puzzle, a story half-written with the final chapters missing. For Auburn, the scar left behind by her murder wasn't just a wound but a constant reminder that not all crimes can be fully understood or resolved. A conviction under question. Ryan Carter's court case ended with a guilty verdict, but doubt regarding his guilt lingers in the minds of many. Supporters of Ryan continue to insist that he was the victim of coincidence, overzealous investigators, and public pressure to deliver results. His case has become a flashpoint for debates about the effectiveness of the justice system. Could circumstantial evidence be enough to convict someone when there's no matching DNA evidence, no murder weapon, and no eyewitnesses? What bothered Ryan's supporters most wasn't just the gaps in the prosecution's case, but the failure to address the evidence from the crime scene that didn't belong to Ryan. The DNA under Jessica's fingernails wasn't his. The unknown blood drops near the basement door weren't his. The hair clutched in Jessica's hand didn't match anyone investigators linked to her personal circle. These were undeniable pieces of forensic evidence pointing to someone else, yet they were never tied to any known suspect. How could the jury convict Ryan while so much evidence suggested the involvement of another, still unidentified person? Even Ryan himself has protested his innocence from the confines of his prison cell. In a letter to a local journalist written 3 years after his sentencing, Ryan claimed, "I love Jessica more than anything, and I would never hurt her. The real monster is walking free while I sit here losing years of my life for something I didn't do." His words have only deepened the divide in Auburn, with some viewing them as the protestations of a guilty man unwilling to face his crime, and others seeing them as the cries of a scapegoat begging to be heard. The shadow of the unknown DNA. The most damning evidence left unexplained in the case is, of course, the DNA recovered from Jessica's fingernails. It represents the most intimate and violent moment of the crime, a detail that Jessica herself in her final moments preserved as a desperate message to investigators. And yet, after exhaustive searches through national databases, the sample has never been matched to anyone. It sits in the evidence locker, a powerful but silent clue, waiting for the right circumstances or technology to identify its origin. Forensics experts have speculated over the years about the possible scenarios involving the DNA. Did it belong to a stranger who broke in randomly? Someone who watched Jessica for weeks and attacked her when they found the opportunity? Or is the answer closer to home? Someone Jessica knew, but whose DNA wasn't previously recorded in law enforcement databases. Either way, the unknown DNA has become a symbol of just how incomplete the case remains. Adding to the shadow cast by the DNA are the blood droplets found near Jessica's basement door. Forensic analysis confirmed that these drops didn't belong to either Jessica or Ryan, but to the same unknown person whose DNA was found beneath her nails. The placement of the drops suggested the attacker had been injured, possibly during Jessica's struggle to defend herself, but no local hospitals or clinics reported treating anyone for suspicious wounds in the days following the murder. If Jessica's attacker was hurt, where did they disappear to? Years after Jessica's death, these clues still linger in Auburn's collective memory. They feel like fragments of a story only partially unveiled, the crumpled page of a mystery novel never finished. And in many ways, this incompleteness has only deepened the frustration of those seeking justice for Jessica. The missing murder weapon. Equally troubling is the fact that the murder weapon has never been found. Jessica suffered blunt force trauma to her head, and experts concluded that the fatal blows were delivered with a heavy, blunt object. Despite an exhaustive search of the crime scene, surrounding areas, and local pawn shops, in case someone tried to sell the weapon, no object matching the description has been recovered. The absence of the murder weapon raises numerous questions. Did the killer take it with them, ensuring it would never be discovered? Was it discarded somewhere far from Auburn, waiting to be uncovered by chance years later? Or could it still be hidden closer to the scene of the crime, overlooked by investigators and lying in plain sight all this time. The lack of this key piece of physical evidence only compounds the uncertainty surrounding Jessica's case. It suggests an attacker who was calm and methodical enough to cover their tracks, or someone who simply got very lucky. Eric Duncan and the unresolved suspicions. The suspicion around Eric Duncan, Jessica's co-worker, lingers just as strongly as doubt surrounding Ryan's guilt. While Eric was never formally charged, his presence in Jessica's orbit continues to be a source of unease for many in Auburn. His poetic letter, his proximity to Jessica's home, Cheryl Matthews' testimony about seeing a bike outside Jessica's house that resembled his, all of these details remain unresolved. Eric's defenders argue that circumstantial evidence doesn't make a killer, but others aren't so sure. Why was Eric unable to account for his bicycle the morning of the murder? Why was his alibi for that time of day suspiciously shaky? And why did Jessica herself feel wary of Eric in the weeks leading up to her death? While some residents whisper that Eric might still somehow be involved, others see him as another unfortunate pawn in a case full of dead ends and inconclusive evidence. The toll on Auburn. For Auburn, the lack of closure in Jessica's murder has left more than just a courtroom legacy. It has created a wound in the very fabric of the town. Once a place where neighbors greeted each other warmly and trust was implicit, Auburn now feels fractured. Residents lock their doors earlier, eye strangers with skepticism, and gossip in hushed tones about who might really be responsible. Jessica's story is retold at community gatherings, schools, and local coffee shops, often with the same question hanging in the air: what really happened? For younger generations growing up in Auburn, Jessica's murder has become a cautionary tale more than a memory. Parents warn their children not to trust easily, a stark contrast to the idyllic sense of safety that used to define the town. A legacy of doubt. Ultimately, the case of Jessica Miller is less about answers and more about what happens when justice feels incomplete. Ryan Carter's conviction satisfied the legal requirement for accountability, but for many in Auburn, it didn't bring the truth they craved. Eric Duncan's shadowy presence in the narrative remains an open question, a murmur in the back of their minds, and the unknown DNA, a ghostly fingerprint of a faceless assailant, continues to haunt the case. Jessica's death isn't just a tragedy, it's a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how even in the tightest-knit communities, some crimes defy comprehension. Auburn may never truly recover from its loss, and Jessica's story, her life, her fight, and the unanswered questions surrounding her murder will likely remain a painful mystery for generations to come.